Evening, everyone. My name is Drew Johnston. I'm the Vice Chair of the Great Decisions Committee and on the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Welcome to our 5th program in our Great Decisions Global Discussion Series. How many here are World Affairs Council members? Oh my goodness, great. Well then, if you're not, you may join us for as little as $10 a year with our email membership. The membership desk is open after the program this evening. You're invited to stop by. We're also selling the Great Decisions textbooks in the lobby, which is kind of some additional information on the topics that we bring up every week. These are $20. We welcome back the students. I think there's a few anyway. There's a couple of universities that are still out in schools on break. Please join me this evening in thanking our sponsor, Western Michigan University. I have a special announcement this evening. It's in a little bit smaller font, so I got to put these on. Just to alert you, we are hosting the noted paleoanthropologist and environmentalist Richard Leakey, of course from the famous Leakey family of paleoanthropologists. Wednesday, April 16th at 7 p.m. right here at the Performing Arts Center. Tickets will be going on sale soon, and as soon as they are, we'll try to let everybody know. How many of you have actually been to Turkey? Yeah, Dixie wasn't close. She said 20%, but that's pretty good. So, now to our evening's armchair discussion. Our council enjoys a special relationship with Dr. Jerry Leach, our guest this evening. He was the national president of the World Affairs Councils of America for over 10 years and is a close colleague of our executive director, Dixie Anderson. Jerry was here when we celebrated our 50th in 1999. You will see Jerry's fondness for the country of Turkey, its people, and its cultures. His passion began exactly 50 years ago when he and his wife went to Turkey as Peace Corps volunteers. He carried that passion throughout his years at the State Department and then to our World Affairs Council system. He is responsible for national systems affiliation with the Turkish Cultural Foundation. Our 92 councils nationwide apply each year to send local staff and their local high school teachers to Turkey each year. I now turn to Dr. Michelle Metro Rowland, our moderator for tonight, and she will introduce Dr. Leach to you. Dr. Metro.
Well, as you saw up here on the slides, we're very excited to have Dr. Jerry Leach with us. He brings a very illustrious CV, including, I believe, a filmmaking award. Yeah. Yes? As you know, Dr. Leach is, in fact, an expert on Turkey, so we're very excited, and I hope we're going to have a lively discussion with lots of times for questions. And we were just chatting ahead of time, and I think, you know, where I'd like to start this conversation is really thinking about Turkey as a regional power. And because of its geography, it really sits in between these two places, right? It sits between the Middle East and Europe, and including kind of an expansive Europe, Europe of the European Union, as well as the former Soviet territories in the Caucasus. And if we start out with the Middle East first, right? Ankara took a very, very calculated and pointed turn to becoming a power player in the Middle East and paying a lot of attention to the events there. And I'm wondering if we can just start out talking about Turkey's role with regard to Syria, maybe the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and just kind of the Middle East in general.
I'll be delighted to do that. Thank you very much, and thanks to the council for the invitation to be here again. I've been looking forward to it. Actually, I'd like to start back one, if you don't mind, and say that modern Turkey, of course, is formed on the remnants of and the parts that fragmented of the Ottoman Empire. The reason for starting there is, of course, you may have read the book, The Peace to End All Peace, which is, of course, the peace after World War I, and it left Turkey, the homeland of the Turkic peoples of Anatolia, if you like, surrounded by 8 different countries, and in one way or another, each of the 8 countries has, until very recently, been had very hostile relations to what was formerly, as they saw it anyway, the mother country, and the mother country in many ways reciprocated with that kind of hostility. So in most of the period that I've been associated with Turkey, other than the last decade, the fact of the matter is the theme that you'd always start with is Turkey, a country that lives in a very tough neighborhood, mainly because its relations of enmity with its 8 neighboring countries, if you like. Well, this particular government, the government of the Justice and Development, or we'll call it AKP from now on, that party, which came into power from 2002 onwards, has basically tried to end that era of animosity that has been born out of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The policy that they've pursued, and pursued with a degree of effectiveness, is called zero problems with neighbors. And zero problems with neighbors has been an attempt to get on board with and build constructive, enthusiastic working relationships with Russia, with Georgia, with Armenia, with Syria, with Iraq, with Cyprus, with Greece, and with Bulgaria. And in one way or another, they've achieved a great deal. And now, of course, there's been some turning back on that. Most recently, of course, the problem that's caused the Turkish government real serious backsliding, is the problem with Syria. The problem with Syria is essentially, of course, it was a former member of the Ottoman Empire. It has, the modern Turkey is now 9 decades old. For 8 decades, the relationship between Turkey and Syria at best was just formal and correct without any enthusiasm or any real depth of interest, and of course a great deal of suspicion between the 2 countries, and once in a while even the threat of war, generally over water issues, if you like. But again, the zero problems with neighbors began to turn that around. The leadership of the AKP basically got to know the Assad regime very well, got to know Assad himself very closely, such the 2 central families of Turkey and Syria took vacations together, and the leadership of both countries got to know each other very well, and basically were starting really to do business with each other in a serious way. Then along came the Arab Spring, or at least the Arab Spring as it started in Syria. That was in this month 3 years ago. It's 36 months old in Syria. And right at the beginning, because of the policy the Turkish government had pursued, the Turkish government basically dug in its heels and said, we support Assad, he should be kept in power. But at the same time, they tried to use the leverage that they saw they had actually acquired through their good neighbors or zero problems policy, and they tried to persuade Assad to not crack down on dissenters in the country, to listen and be willing to make concessions and reforms, to engage in a more more democratization in terms of reform measures, etc., and even touted their own policy vis-a-vis the Kurds in southeastern Turkey as a way forward to deal with the dissenters, the many dissenting groups in Syria. Well, Assad blew that off. He basically had no time for that. He said, essentially, I'm going to do what I need to do, and these people are essentially challenging my authority, and I'm not having it. The classic authoritarian response. The crackdown began, and it got worse and worse, and has continued to get worse and worse. 6 months into it, the Turks got so offended by not being able to get Assad to change his approach and change his mind, etc., that he flipped around 180 degrees. And from August of 2011 through the present day, the goal and the announced and explicit goal of the Turkish government has to get Assad out. And they have basically worked behind the scenes to do everything they can to get the rest of the world to agree with them on that and to support the cause of basically supporting the opposition so as to bring about a fast downfall of Assad. Now, the fast downfall, which they counted on at the beginning of this policy, of course, has not happened, but at the same time, it's caused them to actually back not only the secular and moderate Islamic forces that are challenging Assad, but actually also the radical Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, those forces that are challenging Assad, and the Turks have been sending in weapons and supplies and money to all of the forces challenging the opposition, and that's gotten Turkey in some degree, attracted a certain degree of criticism both from the United States, from the European Union, and from different parts of the Middle East. And that is, of course, that it's had the effect of seeming to want to bring Al-Qaeda and or al-Nusra into power, which is not what they want. They just are trying to get Assad out, if you like. So the end effect of all of this is they have attracted a certain amount of criticism for what they're doing, but it hasn't had affected any change of policy as of this point. Now, let me also mention they've been very, very good about dealing with the refugee crisis. The UNHCR and the European Union have both looked into the handling of refugees in Turkey and said they deserve very, very high marks. They have 600,000 refugees in the country right now, 200,000 along the border. They have a long border of about 500 miles with Syria, and they're spotted all up and down the border, if you like, but they've taken the 400 and spread them out into the 81 provinces and required that the provincial governments and the cities take on board and look after and provide health care and housing and food and shelter and education to the 400 that have been disseminated around the country. And on this basis, they have achieved very high marks for the handling of the refugee situation as it exists today. But at the same time, they've also had to spend something in the order of $2 billion on refugees. And of course, it's not the U.S. economy, even though they've done very well. So they need some help. They want some help, but they're not backing down as more and more refugees flow across the border more or less every day.
Mm-hmm. What about the relationship between Turkey and Israel?
The Israelis and the Turks for a very long time Turkey took a more moderate approach to Israel than the rest of the Islamic world and the rest of the Arab Islamic world in particular. At the same time, they had, an embassy and formal relationships, really, but not much more. But back in the 1990s, when the secular parties were in power, they said, the Israelis are doing very well. We aspire to, and indeed we claim to be the only other democracy in our part of the Middle East, if you like. The Israelis are a democracy, and we can learn a lot from them militarily, and they can basically learn from us as well because we have the kind of military training grounds, airspace, navigation, etc., that the Israelis need for, submarines, for the use of naval forces, and for the training of fighter pilots and the like. So the two got together. They created an ongoing military agreement. There all of a sudden started to be a kind of rapprochement between the Turks and the Israelis, and the Israelis started to flood into Turkey, which has become a very, very popular Middle East site, a lot cheaper, Mediterranean site, a lot cheaper than Spain and Greece and Italy, and of course much closer to Israel, and the Israelis were made to feel welcome, and so the Israelis were going there as a vacation site to the tune of 1 million or 2 million people every year back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, etc. On the other hand, the separation of Gaza from the rest of Israel and the cordoning off of Gaza from the rest of Israel, and if you like, kind of building the wall around Gaza began to introduce a degree of criticism into the relationship and begin to make the current Turkish government think twice about its Israeli relationship and basically to cool off, if you like. And so in 2010, this cooling off led to a series of NGOs coming together, putting 9 vessels into the water, staffed by members not of the Turkish government, but of various Turkish NGOs with a lot of prominent Turks on board, including Turkish Americans, of whom there are some 250,000 or so. And these 9 ships set out for Gaza, and they were going to go straight into Gaza, and it was a flotilla essentially of aid, the kind of aid and food supplies and industrial supplies that Gaza really needs, and of course Israel's been very reluctant to allow in. The Israeli government basically saw this as the first real attempt to breach the wall, if you like, around Gaza, and they were not having it, so they sent out commando forces along with the Israeli Navy, and they came out by commando helicopters, and they helicoptered down on the 9 vessels, and there was a shootout, and 11 Turks were killed, as I remember, and the vessels turned around and went back home. But from that point on, the military relationship went sour and exists really largely only on paper. It hasn't been abrogated or the like, but it exists only on paper. The Turks have demanded an apology, and the Israeli government has been unwilling to give it. The Turks have demanded a further openness in terms of Gaza, and the Israelis have, if you like, opened the door maybe another 2 inches or something like that. In other words, not much to write home about, if you like. And so the Turkish government is not at all interested in good relations with Israel again until this incident of what is called the Blue Marmara, or in Turkey, the Mavi Marmara, that's the name of the ship, if you like, that led the flotilla, etc. And until this problem gets solved, then there's not going to be many Israeli tourists coming again to Anatolia. There's not going to be a lot of joint scholarly conferences the way they were. There were not going to be joint Israeli-Turkish projects planned, and the military relationship has essentially gone down to practically zero, and that's, I think, the way it will stand until either there are secular parties that win the national elections in Turkey, and that does not seem likely in the near term, or that the Israeli government plucks up its courage and does something different about Ghazi and admits to wrongdoing in terms of mistreatment of what the Turks saw was virtually allies. They saw themselves as virtually allies, though there was no really an alliance relationship between the 2 countries. And so as they see it, they were being mistreated badly by allies, and they're just not having it. Until this is sorted out again, there won't be any improvement, in my opinion.
What about the rumors that the Israelis are actually paying reparations, but they're doing it kind of quietly and under the table?
Well, there are quiet talks going on. I haven't heard about quiet reparations payments, but if it's there, the Turkish press is very, very lively, and it's almost like Washington. You know, there are almost no secrets in Ankara any longer, because they're all over the place, and there's so many of them. You know, there are 40 national newspapers, and there's 16 national TV channels, and Lord knows the number of investigative journalists, the number of people who've, you know, won their spurs through journalism is measured in the thousands in Turkey. So they dig out everything. So they've dug out the fact that the foreign minister's carrying on behind the scenes talks, and they are basically hoping this will lead to a denouement, basically a resolution which both governments can resolve. But I don't know about reparations. It doesn't sound like something the current Israeli government would do, but let's hope.
Right. I definitely want to get into this issue with press freedoms in Turkey, but before we go into the internal affairs, I want to ask you about Turkey and the European Union and where Turkey stands with regard to its bid for membership.
Well, all of you know from your history books that it started, as 6 countries in the heart of Western Europe, with the Treaty of Rome in 1956, and the beginning of essentially the common market, the common market back in 1957. Well, what people don't really know is the next country to actually apply and try to get in was actually Turkey, 1959. And the European Union was very surprised and basically said essentially, you're nowhere near on par with the other members, and so we can't do this right now, and all of our membership is in a contiguous area. We're a contiguous block of nations, and you're way off on the fringe. So it gave them a set of excuses and invented something called associate membership, which essentially was a written agreement that Turkey could advertise, if you like, put on its resume. And they achieved that in '63 and became an associate member, the first associate member of the European Union back in 1964. Now, since that time, and throughout that period as well, Turkey's experienced military intervention. And it's had 4, if you like, 3, coup d'etats, and the 4th, which is essentially a soft coup d'etat in 1997. This has raised the backs of the European Union. They basically made a very, very hard point about this. We're not letting anybody into this club who does not have civilian control of its military. And you have now shown that your military is ready, willing, and able to step in, which it has effectively done, 4 times over the last 50 years. So you got really no chance of getting into the European Union until you display to us that you control your military. Despite this, the Turks applied again in 1987. They applied under the government of the reformist former World Bank Vice President Turgut Özal, who had a big change in terms of the liberalization and opening of the Turkish economy and began essentially building the infrastructure of the boom that's been going on in Turkey, primarily over the last 10 years, especially. Well, he started off and basically said, we want in, and we'll do what it takes. Tell us what you want us to do, etc. And the European Union started dribbling things out the side door, essentially saying, well, you've got this following very, very long list of problems in Turkey, things that you're going to have to correct before we'll even allow you to be a candidate country. And that candidate country is essentially when you get a chance to really negotiate the accession process, which is itself a very detailed and several year-long process called accession, if you like. Well, they kept plowing away at it, some backsliding, if you like, etc., but moving forward from that point on. But then they reached 1997, and they had effectively said, what about now? We've done so much over the last decade. Surely give us a signal that we have a realistic chance of being a member of the European Union, if not immediately, at least someday. And the answer from the Council of Ministers in 1997 was, okay, if you want an answer, the answer is you will never, ever be a member of the European Union. Is that it? Is that what you wanted to hear? And of course, the Turks were absolutely just shocked, as they never, ever expected that answer. But they didn't give up. They didn't give up. The U.S. supported them. A number of countries in Europe, starting with the U.K., supported them. Even the Germans at that point in time supported them. And they kept plugging away at it. And they said, we're going to keep on basically changing the things that need changing, etc. And we have a lot of things going for us, and you need us as much as we need you. And they started making the case for the first time why the European Union needed them. And lo and behold, they got a reversal out of the Council of Ministers in 1991, which said, now that we've established real criteria for candidacy, these are called the Copenhagen criteria, and the criteria are that you are a democratic country, that is essentially that you have the institutions of democracy and you're on your way to becoming a democracy. You adhere to the rule of law, starting with having constitution, which is the fundamental law of the land. You basically have a protected space. You have protections built in for the human rights and protections for minorities. And the Turks said essentially, yes, we can do that, and if you find any flaws with us on those 4 grounds, tell us and we'll start dealing with them. And the European Union responded in 2001, 2, 3, and finally in 2004. Enough had been done that the European Union said, yes, you have met the basic requirements, the sufficient criteria of the Copenhagen criteria, and we can now start the accession process. Proviso, footnote, we can start the accession process, but 1, it doesn't mean you're automatically going to get in, and 2, you're probably not going to get in anytime soon. And one of the reasons is you are still poorer than the poorest country in Europe, so we're not going to let you in the door until that changes, etc. Okay, so the Turks said, wow, that's wonderful. We can start the accession process. So they started it basically, essentially a little over 8 years ago, December 2005. Now, accession means several things. First of all, you have to go through 35 separate negotiations with separate teams from Brussels, essentially conforming your laws and regulations to 80,000 pages of European Union law and regulation, and they're in the middle of that now. They've completed one of these, and they have 13 more open for discussion, which means they have 21 more that are not open, and some of those are actually blocked. They're blocked by the French and by the Greek Cypriots, largely because the Turks will not recognize the membership of Greek Cyprus in the European Union, and basically not recognize that the obligations of the customs union that the Turks have negotiated, free tariffs, no tariffs between EU and Turkey on industrial goods, they will not recognize that applies to the Greek Cypriots. So there are 8 of the negotiating or chapters, the European Union calls it. The chapters are basically blocked and will remain blocked in all probability until the problems with Cyprus are essentially solved. Well, the problems with Cyprus are not going anywhere right now, so unless somebody can come up with a real problem with Cyprus, and it needs another one of these back-channel negotiations, which, by the way, the Turkish foreign minister, the architect of the zero problems with neighbors, and he's really good at this kind of back-channel solution of problems based on compromises and flexibility on the Turkish side. If anybody's going to pull it off, it's going to be the current the current foreign minister, as opposed to the current prime minister, who's sort of got his back up over Cyprus, where he feels like he's been badly treated, if you like. So that's where they stand with the European Union. They still strongly aspire to get in. They basically have now, unbeknownst to people, actually reached the point in terms of gross national product that their basic economy is on par with the 2 bottom economies of the European Union, namely the economies of Romania and of Bulgaria. So they're on that par, if you like, but they need to get up further before the countries that are really against them. And the countries that are really against them are now France, Germany, Austria, Britain is very much on their side and has been their big champion all along. Pardon me, there are 2 others, and they're just not coming to mind, but I'll think of them. Poland is one, and I think Hungary is the other, if you like. So they've got to overcome these. Public opinion in the European Union is against them. About 2/3 of the European Union believes they should not be, public opinion should not be allowed to join, but public opinion has really lost out in terms of other memberships of the European Union. So the governments don't have a strong track record of following public opinion in the different parts of the European Union when the final voting takes place. When the final voting takes place, the rules still remain what they were originally, and that is that each country that's a member of the European Union essentially gets a veto power. So only one country, like Greek Cyprus says no, that's it. There's no further appeal, if you like. There can be another application, but there's no appeal to that. And of course, but the rules might change, but they haven't changed through all the many iterations, treaty, Maastricht, Lisbon, and the like. So they haven't changed yet. And I might also add, nobody sat and thought about it, but in fact there are five former members of the Ottoman Empire that are actually now members of the European Union. Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, if you like. So the end effect of that is if they harbor the kind of hostility that you might very well imagine, the kind of hostility that the Austrians harbor to this day because of the many challenges to Austria under the Ottoman Empire, they may not get in because of historical animosities. Remember the peace to end all peace at the end of World War I. They may not get in because the historical animosities may overwhelm what will be a 30 or 40 year bid to become a member of the European Union. Nevertheless, they strongly aspire to it. They have strong reasons they can give for going into the European Union, and they also now have devised a set of reasons why they should also stay out, which they didn't have 10 years ago. So they're arguing about it internally because they know it's iffier than they thought it was, if you like, even though they're going through the accession process.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to the internal politics a little bit. And I'm wondering, we've already talked a bit about the AKP and touched really briefly on the role of the military within Turkish politics historically. I'm wondering if you could just give us kind of a lay of the land of the political parties, and there's a whole series of elections coming up, and what you foresee happening.
Well, first, on short form, there are 3 different elections coming up. The first is the municipalities. Turkey is a very centralized government, and basically the elected officials are all at the top and at the bottom. At the municipality in between is all appointed officials. It's certainly not a federal form of government, if you like. So the municipalities count, and there are something like 3,600 municipal officials spread throughout many towns, cities, and even villages in Turkey, if you like. That comes up at the end of March. So that's the next big election. It's basically like 3 weeks off, etc. Right now, the AKP, the basically moderately religious party of the right that's dominated national politics for the last 3 cycles, the election of 2002, 2007, and 11, they dominate at the municipal level as well. So they are basically have the largest array of candidates, and they've done very well as mayors and as city councils, largely because they've devised and created a very, very good track record through this party for ending corruption, and also paying very good attention to the delivery of municipal services. They pay a lot more attention to than the other parties do to keeping the street lights on, filling the potholes, basically seeing that the sewers work, that the running water is pure, that the dung is swept up off of the street, and basically the streets that are paved are all washed regularly and the like. They pay a lot of attention to that, and it wins them a lot of votes locally. So these are their strengths, and that continued to be their strengths for the better part of about 30 years, if you like, and they also have been very, very clean. Indeed, the AK party, known in English and in Turkish as the AKP, if you like. Basically, the AK stands for, in Turkish, first and foremost, it means white. Secondly, the word also means pure. And thirdly, it means essentially clean. And in political terms, it means not corrupt, if you like. And that's the reason for this very clumsy political name being given to this party. And that is essentially that they are advertising that we are the non-corrupt party in Turkey, and you can count on that, etc. And indeed, the National Party has been free of corruption charges for 10 out of the 11 years. Unfortunately, they are right in the middle of the biggest corruption scandal they've ever had right now, and the effect that it's going to have on the March 30 municipal elections, which are entirely municipal, then followed by what are imagined to be the August elections, the first election of a Turkish president based on a popular direct vote. In other words, everybody coming out and everybody voting for X or Y or Z, for that matter, on the ballot box, etc. Because all previous elections of the president have been done by the parliament. Now it's done by direct vote as a result of constitutional amendments back about 4 years ago, etc. And then next year they elect again the parties of the parliament. There are 25 parties in Turkey, 15 of them challenged for seats in the 2007 election, and only 3 passed the threshold. The Turks have, because of having so many parties, have set the threshold that any given party has to win 10% of the national vote in order to have any seats at all in the national parliament. And only 3 passed the post in 2007, and then a series of independents have formed themselves into effectively what is essentially a crypto-Kurdish party, if you like, and represent Kurdish interests. So they're really, if you like, now 4 parties, but only 3 that got in through the front door of the elections in 2007. So what really is at issue, since the AKP is almost certain to win the municipal elections again, the only thing that's really at issue is who's going to be the mayor of Ankara, because the mayor of Ankara and the mayor of Istanbul are the 2 biggest mayoral elections in the whole country, and they outshine any other posts that are being competed for and will be competed for on March the 30th. Then the presidency will come up, and the issue will be, will the current president, who is also in the AKP, Abdullah Gül, who is more moderate than the current prime minister, Erdogan, not pronounced with a G in it, for those of you who've seen it in print, Erdogan, it's as if the G disappears. Erdogan, he wants to run for president, but now that he has this corruption charge staring him in the face, it's not at all clear that he could do it. In other words, it's clear that if he wanted that nomination, he could get the nomination. It's not clear whether he could win the presidency. But since his own party elects him prime minister, he'd be certain to win the prime ministry, but he has to change the rules of his own party, which says you can be prime minister 3 times, but then you have to step down. But it's not a national regulation, and it's certainly not a national law, so it'd be very easy to change if he chose to change it in June or May or whenever he wanted to. Then the big issue with what would be the constellation of the distribution of seats next year in the parties. And of course, the AKP holds about 50% of the seats right now, and the betting amongst the smart money and all the smart journalists in Turkey is that they lose ground on the 50% and they'd go back to 40 or something like that, unless there's some incredible and unexpected denouement to these very, very serious corruption charges that are facing the AKP party in power in the parliament and also the prime minister himself. So that's essentially where the lay of the land is.
Can you talk a little bit about this latest political crisis with Erdogan, and then also maybe if we can go back and think about why the AKP has been so successful historically, and maybe if the protests and the crackdown was really kind of the beginning of Erdogan's possible downfall?
Well, there are certainly people that see it, but there are also people who see it that way, but there are many people who are betting that it will not be his downfall. More, if you like, because of the economic success of the party. Okay, you wanted to start with the scandal, the corruption scandal, right?
We can start there, sure.
Okay.
Corruption's always good.
You tell me where you want to start, and we'll start there. If it's not the corruption scandal, or otherwise known as the December the 17th events, you tell me where else we'll start.
Let's start there.
December the 17th. All of a sudden, on the internet, there appeared a whole series of revelations about AKP ministers and the AKP party basically being on the take and taking from businessmen and from companies, primarily in Europe, and from around the Middle East, and from Iranians, and from people in Dubai and the Persian Gulf, if you like, taking very, very, very large sums of money, measured in the tens of millions of euros and dollars. Now, what the shock of all of this was that, of course, for 10 straight years, this party had been in power, and unlike any party before them, had essentially had no charges against it for any corruption at all. In other words, it had lived up to its reputation of being the clean party, if you like. And then out of the blue came December the 17th, and simultaneously with these newspaper articles and these transmissions on the internet, and some transmissions that basically came from out of wiretapping, and obviously somehow came from within the Turkish telecommunications agency, which does all the wiretapping, legal and illegal, in Turkey. Basically, these things and certain conversations by the ministers arrived on the internet, etc. At the same time that the Turkish public was seeing all of this, the prosecutors and the police, who work very, very closely together, almost like one team, if you like, were basically seizing people at home, rounding up people, taking them into custody, made 18 arrests, followed by 25 more arrests 7 days later, and still have a series of those people in jail, trying to further nail down the evidence against them after household searches and bank records and the like. In light of these revelations, 4 of the cabinet ministers, including, I might add, the minister in charge of negotiations with the European Union, has resigned. Not the prime minister and not the foreign minister, but for the economics minister and the minister for European Union and the minister in charge of construction and the minister in charge of international cooperation, I believe. They've resigned, and it's assumed that the working assumption of the general public is that their resignation basically establishes that they are guilty, because there's no other reason for them to resign other than an admission of guilt, if you like. So that's not good news, if you like. Now, on that day, the prime minister was illegally wiretapped, and wiretapped on 5 different telephone calls, basically talking to his son at home. His son's named Bilal, and he basically told his son, they're out arresting people, and the homes of the cabinet ministers are now being there's warrants to search all the homes of the cabinet ministers, etc., etc. Son, you've got to get all the money out of the house. And there are 5 conversations. These, by the way, were finally all played on internet websites about two weeks ago, really, right in the middle of February. And man, I'm talking about, the shockwave that went through the party, and the shockwave that went through the electorate as well, because they really didn't expect that it was going to be the prime minister. They really thought, what can you do? You're always going to have corrupt ministers and corrupt politicians, but not Erdogan. No, not Erdogan. Oh, my God. And so, basically, there's 5 conversations. They've all been played. They've all been, put out on the internet. They're still there to be listened to, and they've been transcribed and put down in print on the internet. And at the end of it, the 5th call, the prime minister calls up his son in 11 o'clock at night and said, "Son, did you get all the money essentially out of the house? Did you put it into the places that I told you, that you got it to other places where our relatives are, etc., etc.?" He said, basically, Baba or Dad, I did my best, but there's so much here, I couldn't get it all out of the house. So we've still got 30 million euros in the house. And I'll do my best to get it out of the house tomorrow, but there's nothing I can do about it by now. But the father, being very resourceful, by the next day had basically transferred all of the prosecutors involved and all of the policemen that involved in the searches, etc. And then he went on to transfer something in the order of about 80 prosecutors who had anything to do with this affair, and then something in the order of about 4,000 policemen out of Ankara and out of Istanbul, etc. So basically, he's defanged and basically taken the guts out of this investigative search by the police and the prosecutors, and that's where things stand. And while theoretically the investigation is still going on, it's not clear whether the Prime Minister is going to be charged or whether these illegal telephone calls will be followed up. In the meantime, Erdogan has come up with a defense, and his defense is, of course, clearly a charade to deflect attention to what's happening. And the deflection essentially says, this episode in our national life is being caused by the other religiously oriented group, which is not in power, and that have been our partners, but are now showing us their fangs, etc., and have basically sought now to bring down this government without saying, but oh, by the way, we've been partnered with them to win votes for the last 10 years, and it's been a very, very effective partnership. But now they've turned on us, and as you know, they have a parallel government within the government, and that parallel government is within the Justice Department, it's within the prosecutors, and it's in the police force, and it's in the Ministry of Interior, and it's in the judges. And they have pulled the strings, and because they are disliked our decision to close down their college prep courses around the country, they have basically shown us what they can do, and they're basically now gunning to bring us down, and we need to stop allowing them to have a kind of unelected political power over the fortunes of those who have been elected. And he's had such standing with the election or the electorate as a whole that basically he's been able to make this case and have most Turks believe it, if you like. So that's where things stand right now. So what the future holds is anybody's guess. By the way, this is pretty much tantamount to Turkey's version of Watergate. And the Turks, go and rush to the internet and rush to the radio and rush to the newspapers every day to see what the next chapter of everything unfolds. And there's so much illegal wiretapping going on that there's regarded to me in a large number of things that are yet to come out that are going to surface as the investigations deepen and as more people know about it and inform on it, if you like.
And of course, you're making reference to Gulen and the Gulenist, and this leads to one of the really important questions, I think, in terms of thinking about the AKP and contemporary Turkey, is the role of Islam. Of course, with the creation of modern Turkey, we get a secular state. A very forceful imposition of secularism.
Very hard-edged secularism.
Right, and so
tough.
So I think the question is how Islamist is in fact the AKP.
Okay, all right. Well, Ataturk, of course, began the reform, ended the Ottoman Empire, began the reform, set the country on its path towards democracy. And of course, of the many things that he instituted secularism, and it was secularism with a very, very hard edge. In other words, don't challenge it or you'll be in trouble, etc. But Ataturk had such standing as the savior of the people, the creator of the Turkish homeland, the person who had, at the head of the Turkish independence army, had pushed the Greeks out of Anatolia, had negotiated the end of British occupation, French occupation, Italian occupation, been able to take back over the international space, Istanbul, etc., that he was, approaching the status of, living God almost. It overdoes it. But basically, he was a national hero of the sort the Turks had not had for several centuries. And so he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. Well, when he went into civilian life or went into the presidency, he took his uniform off, basically ended his relationship with the military, and a lot of the military officers of the time followed him and became the leaders of, in civilian clothes, of the Republican People's Party, the Ataturkist Party, which is still the number 2 party in the Turkish parliament today. And basically they led the country through essentially 27 years worth of reform, building the infrastructure of a modern society, a modern economy, and a modern democracy, if you like. And of course, at that point in time, the military was back on the reservation, but it looked at the government and said, those are our heroes. Those are the people that we most believe in. Those are our champions, if you like. There's no way we're going to do anything to ever cross Ataturk while he's president. And of course, it was his number 2 lieutenant who followed him as president for essentially 13 or 12 years after Ataturk had died. So you had the leaders of the revolution in civilian clothes basically leading the country for 27 years. Now, they started in 1950 to the multi-party system. And as soon as there were multiple parties and the Turks could vote their real interest in what they wanted to do, as opposed to just voting for the Republican People's Party, which is essentially what they had been doing up until that time, a whole array of parties sprang up and began to win votes across the spectrum, as you might well imagine, from left to right and from secular to religious, if you like. And one of those parties was the Democrat Party, and the Democratic Party essentially governed Turkey in the 1950s. One of the things about the Democratic Party rule was that it began to draw the line between secularism and the religious society, if you like, in a different place from Ataturk. And that really upset the military, put them on edge, and out of that came basically the self-anointed role or the charge the Turkish military have given themselves, and lest I be mistaken on the basis of what I know of the Turkish military, the view they still hold, even though they're back on the reservation now, the view they still hold is they are the guardians of the Ataturkist revolution. They are the ones there to see that if any party takes the country, or if anything in the political system happens to cause the country to veer off of the path, left or right, that Ataturk set, they will step in and correct the situation. And so their first episode of standing in and correcting, if you like, was 1960. And they basically knocked the Democratic Party, which is a moderately Islamic party, out of power. They hung the prime minister and 2 ministers, and then they started the pattern of military intervention. Push the parties out of power, get the leaders of the party under house arrest, or in that particular case, detention, arrest, sometimes exile, and sometimes execution, etc. Reform the political structure. In the case of 1960, they rewrote the Constitution. They had a Constitution 1961, different from the Ataturkist Constitution, if you like. And then they hold elections and then turn the government back over to the powers that be, and that is the parties that won the election. They step back into their role as the defenders, the military defenders of the nation, not the political defenders of the Ataturkist path. And so they've done that 3 times, 71 and 80 again. The longest period of time they've ever stayed in power has been 3 years, so they've been total of 6 years, only one time 3 years in power. The 4th intervention was pushing the parties out, but not basically taking over and making people in uniform the heads of the government and the like, etc. The Turks have basically liked their intervention, but now they're all aware of the fact that they will never, ever get into the European Union if the military continues to take over. They know this is one of the sine qua nons of European membership. They must show established, continuing, legitimate political control, civilian political control over the military. If not, everything's off the table. Forget it, in other words. So a certain portion of the Turks, especially the educated elite, have turned against the military. not against it as an institution, but against it in terms of intervention. Indeed, the military is still the institution of highest regard in the whole of the Turkish government apparatus, bar none, including the AKP party and every other party you ever heard of and all the rest of it. I mean, when you rank the institutions of Turkish society, the Turkish military is always at the top of the tree, and it today, despite the enormous scandal that it went through from 2007 through August 2013, where so many military officers were imprisoned, essentially they basically, still have that kind of standing, if you like. And we'll go into why that is if you want to. What's brought about the military interventions is generally one of two reasons or two combined. One, the government in power is beginning to draw the line between secularism and in the religious space in society in a way that the government regards it as a fundamental breach of a red line set by Ataturk. And then once it was both at the same time, both because of the breaking of the red line and also because of total internal chaos where left and right were fighting each other and killing people at the rate of 10, 20, 25, 30 people a day throughout the whole country. In other words, public chaos, that the Turkish military stepped in 1980 and took over and basically rewrote another constitution, which made a lot of things clear and also put into the 1982 constitution that the Turkish military is, in fact, this is the first time the doctrine ever went into writing, that it is, in fact, the defenders of the Ataturkist revolution and the Ataturkist path on which the country was set from 1923 onwards to the present day, if you like. So that's the standing Turkish constitution for what it's worth. Now, the other parties that have grown up and made their mark have been from 1965 through the present day a series of parties that have either been implicitly, in other words, everybody knew they were religiously oriented, but nothing was said in the party platform, or alternatively, explicitly, they've been a part, they've basically redrawn the line and campaigned on it. There have been a series of religious parties that have made their mark. National Salvation Party, followed by the Welfare Party, followed by the Virtue Party, followed by the Solidarity Party, followed by the AKP, etc. 5 of them. What happened to the first 4? Basically, the Turkish Constitutional Court stepped in and shut them down and said these parties basically are offending. They are unconstitutional in light of the degree to which they offend the secularist plank of the Turkish constitutions of 1923, 61, and 82, etc. So the 4 predecessors of the current religious party have essentially all been shut down, closed, etc., and the party leaders pushed out of power, generally meaning they've been put into house arrest, if you like. Now, the effect of shutting down 4 parties that have had a similar outlook and basically have had some overlap of membership throughout those 5 iterations, etc., has caused religious parties to become more and more and more and more moderate over essentially a 50-year span of time. So the current party in power, the AKP party, which we've talked about, essentially does not say that it's an Islamic party. It doesn't say we are an Islamist party. In fact, those are fighting words. If you talk to somebody in the AKP and say, oh, well, you're just another Islamist party like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and man, you're in for real trouble then, because that they absolutely want to deny. But at the same time, they can't deny that the legacy of the party comes from out of that set of people in Turkish society, and of course, they've done very well amongst that portion of the electorate, etc. So that part of the Turkish electorate is here to stay. Who knows, the AKP party might itself be shut down one day. In fact, the prosecutor's office basically set out to do exactly that in 2007, but it didn't carry the day, and by 1 vote on the Constitutional court, the Turkish equivalent of our Supreme Court. The party survived, and Erdogan, etc., survived, but it won't say that it won't happen again in the future. But if it does, it means that, you know, that party will resurrect itself with a new name and with new leaders and a new platform, etc. The template I use when I think about Turkish politics, moving the template according to the circumstances of the time, is essentially that about 1/3 of the electorate are people who support the kind of party, the party that wants to be and is proud of and happily a religious party that basically wants to draw the line in a substantially different place from where Ataturk drew the line. There are the independents in the middle, there are another third, and there's the educated elite, the urban elite, the people who are very well educated, very well traveled, all these journalists that we're talking about, the faculty members of 186 universities, the rapidly increasing Turkish middle class, the people who've got some decent middle class wealth, and indeed the wealthy class, etc. That's about 25% of Turkey, and then there's another 10% that follow their lead. So effectively it's a third, a third, a third. And the third is secular, a third is religious, and in the middle are the independents, sort of like the U.S., and every election is about who's going to get those independents.
Okay, we're going to go to some Q&A right now, if you don't mind. Please feel free to text the number up on the screen if you don't feel comfortable coming down. But I'll start with the first question. Can you briefly describe the role of the U.S. military in Ankara as it is now compared to what it has been in the past?
The U.S. military, of course, well, first of all, the beginning of the U.S. relationship, which led ultimately to the U.S. being, the U.S. troops being there, was essentially with the Point 4, or the U.S. aid program, which started basically with Truman, and the goal was to keep the Soviet Union and communism out of Turkey after World War II, if you like. And that's what got it all going, and it was a very robust effort. It built a lot of the current roads. It basically mechanized a portion of agriculture, et cetera, and it helped a lot of the ministries really get off the ground and be properly staffed and the like. But so much for that. The military part of it really started with Turkish membership in NATO in 1952. The Turks have won very, very strong approval from all of their NATO partners, certainly the core 16, if you like, but also, what are we now in terms of NATO membership? The 27. The Turks have lived up to their obligations very, very carefully and very enthusiastically, not trying to do the minimum they could get away with or to get, to basically skirt around, etc. They're very proud of the Europeanization of the officer corps of the Turks. The Turkish officers all speak English, some of them almost like their native speakers. They've all visited the Pentagon. They've been to training courses at the Naval War College, the Air Force Command and Staff School in Montgomery, the Army War College in Carlisle, all over the United States, and military training programs, etc. So there's been a very, very close relationship, and out of this close relationship came the U.S. stationing people in Turkey primarily for the sake of surveillance of the Soviet Union. So surveillance across the Black Sea and out on the eastern border of Turkey, which was surveillance into Kazakhstan and Central Asia, but it also had the benefit of surveillance over into Iran and Iraq as need be, and into, of course, the stands in Central Asia and the like. And it was that central role of surveillance that led to basically putting in listening stations, linguistically trained, essentially people in the Air Force, to a lesser degree in the Army, built up a contingent around the country, which at its peak, which was probably in the late 1960s and early 70s, around 25,000 troops. But then when basically the conflict, but the polarization between left and right started, it sucked in the military personnel, the U.S. military personnel, and they began to be kidnapped and killed, and eventually the Pentagon said, we got to staff this down, and started to pull down 25,000, and it went down to about 8. And then when the AKP party took over, it was down to about 6,000. And the AKP party said, we'd really rather not have all these forces there. And, oh, by the way, you don't really need a listening post into the Soviet Union, even though, a listening post into Russia, they've not really given that up, if you like, etc. So the end effect is the military detachments headquartered in Ankara are very, very small. There's the biggest part of the relationship is the military supply relationship into the Turkish military, which has all kinds of U.S. equipment, some of it paid for by the U.S. foreign aid program, and some of it simply paid for out of the Turkish budget, etc. Some of the listening stations are still there, if you like, and some of them are still manned by a few U.S. personnel, but mostly Turkish personnel now. And yet the NATO relationship, is still a very, very strong one, even though most of external NATO has been moved out of Turkey, including the NATO naval base in Izmir.
I think there's a question over there.
A quick one. Does the Turkish government have any influence as a third party to be able to broker between the U.S. and Russia and the two proxy wars that are going on in that region?
The relationship, the warming of relations with Russia is really not that old. And while the key Turkish leaders have met Putin and met, is it Ivanov, the foreign minister, and the military, the head of the defense ministry and the like, I would say the relations are really not that deep, etc. So the Turks have basically essentially signaled to the outside world that they are not seeking to have a major role in the Ukrainian Crimean affair, but their principal role is going to be speaking up to protect the Tartars, in other words, Turkish-speaking Crimeans that are still in Crimea, partly because the other half of the Crimean Tartars are actually over in Turkey. So there's a large diaspora community of Crimean Turks, and the Turks know very well who they are, and they've been very upstanding members of society, and they're going to stand behind them, etc. So they basically made it clear they're not going to be part of the job of brokering a deal with the authorities in Moscow, but what they are going to do is speak out on behalf of protections for the Crimean Tartars. That's the way they've defined their role as of the present.
Time for one more question, and then we're going to have to get things closed out.
Yep, this is on text. Could you please speak a little bit more about Gulen and his movement? They're amassing a lot of influence. What's his or their end game?
Okay. The leader of the movement is given, you'll discover all this is very informal, but his name is Fethullah, I'll say it again, Fethullah Gulen, G-U with an umlaut, L-E-N. And so the movement is known as the Gulen movement, or the Fethullah Gulen movement, or the Gulenist movement, or sometimes by the Turkish name, Cemaat, which means community, and Hizmet, which means service. So it has a series of names. Why would it have so many different names? Because largely it is essentially a network of like-minded people and not an organization with a board, with an official leader, with an official budget, etc. It is essentially a large network which started within Turkey, and something in the order of 3 to 6 million people identify themselves as members of this network, and something now that it's spread outside of Turkey, something in the order of 10 to 30 million people in different parts of the world, largely where Muslims are, and generally that means Turkic-speaking Muslims like Central Asia and in the Balkans, etc. That's where the Gulenists are. Now, what is the Gulen movement? What does it stand for? Well, Gulen's philosophy is essentially a philosophy of trying to find a working synthesis between Islam and the desires of the Turkic peoples to be modern, to be democratic, to have open societies, to be societies of the type that they see prospering and doing so well in Europe and the United States. Open societies with free speech and freedom of the press and protected civil rights, and the like. It's essentially trying to find the synthesis between the requirements of Islam and the requirements of being essentially a modern, democratic, open, liberal society, if you like. So it's essentially a movement dedicated to finding this area of synthesis and injecting a new spirit into the Islamic world, starting with the Turkic portion of the Islamic world, and then after that, the Arabic portion of the Islamic world, followed by the Persian part of the Islamic world, and on and on. And this is what is so appealing to, if you like, what otherwise would be called the modernists in the Turkish world, and that there are plenty of them, and plenty of them have dedicated their lives to it and are as strongly committed to being a modern society as any Islamist you'll ever run into, Turkic or otherwise, if you like. So the Gulenist movement are the people who basically bought into this philosophy, believe that all of these things are possible, believe that a ground of compatibility so that you can be championing both democracy and Islam without looking back, without wanting to turn society back 14 centuries and resurrect the society of the 7th century, which was tribal and, born of a different time and a different era, and born in a different region of the world, all of which to them, to the Fethullah Gulenists, makes no sense whatsoever. They want a forward-looking religion, one in which you can be genuinely spiritual and at the same time democratic, modern, travel the world, stand up for what you believe in, but it's not really fundamentally incompatible with the open nature of Christianity and the open nature of Judaism, such that when it is open, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the kind of thing that they're after. That's the kind of thing that has appealed to the modernists around the Turkic-speaking world, and therein lies the power of the Gulenist movement. The one thing the Gulenists have said through the speaker, through the leader, the Fethullah Gulen, and you'll never guess where he lives. He lives in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, because he's in a self-imposed exile because the secularists of Turkey hammered him so hard through the press and through the television and through publications that he just didn't feel welcome in Turkey any longer back in the 1990s. So that's where he lives. So he's rather, in a way, detached, but it's also led to the Gulenist movement spreading into Central Asia and into the Balkans and into the parts of Europe and into the UK and into parts of the United States and Canada, etc. So that's where the overseas members are from. So that's Gulenism, if you like, in a nutshell. It's still a growing movement. It has not been and will not be, according to the founder, will never be a political party, will never seek to run in elections, will never seek to be a formal organization, and will never seek to hold political power, because it sees change not as coming through the top-down method of all the parties going back to Istanbul, back to Ataturk, all the way to the present day, changing the laws, changing the policies, and trying to remake the people. No, their goal is to remake the people one at a time. In other words, it's a complete exercise in bottom-up reforming of Muslims, if you like, to make the modern world that they live in and make them compatible with the modern world and happy to be a part of it. So that's it, really, in a nutshell. And that's the part that's just had the split with the AKP after supporting it for 10 straight years and helping it get its big majorities to get it into power without any coalition partners.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Leach and Dr. Metro Rowland. Our next session is next Monday, March 17th, with Reza Marashi on the unintended consequences of the Arab Spring. You may remember that this is the young man who received a standing ovation for his presentation on Iran and Syria last year. Our meeting is adjourned, the membership desk is open, and the books are on sale. Thank you all for coming.